Hello and welcome. My name is Bob Tickelman. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer, and I'm excited to present to you today this lesson on what you want to know when you want to know it. Today, we're going to be looking specifically at designing Microsoft Azure infrastructure solutions as part of the AZ305 Architect class. This module is going to focus on a series of migration solutions, and I'm really excited to present this because this solution has grown over a period of time. From early on in Azure, we didn't have a tool to present a migration solution, and we used a tool called ASR, Azure Site Recovery, to provide that migration. Now we have a full tool that provides the entire gambit of activities that should take place as you perform a migration. The ASR solution missed some of these. There's a quantify value, there's gather information. We'll go into all of this in the lesson. But, what we're going to take a look at is actually building this solution and having a cloud-hosted feature that allows you to now plan, gather the information, and provide a migration for a variety of different workloads. And so you can see that at the middle of the bullet points there. We have different workloads that we can work with, whether it be a virtual machine migration from a VM on premises to a VM on cloud. How do I take an application and maybe move that application? How do I take a SQL server? Do I do a live data migration, or am I just doing an offline migration? So there's all these different options for us to go through and perform the migration. One of the other things that it can provide is it can do an inventory of the resources, either automatically or manually, that you can augment. And it allows you to do sample migrations. And it will come back with reports to say, gosh, one of 4 conditions. This device, it's ready to go. It's, meets all the requirements. Or this device maybe needs something done to it. Maybe I need to make a patch, or maybe it needs waiting for a reboot to take place. Maybe it needs to have, it's not capable at all. There's a significant change that has to happen, or you got to find a different migration path. Or the final one is it can't gather any information. Now that's typically because it's unable to reach the device. It's turned off, it's in a network segment it doesn't have access to, or there's permissions that are preventing that. So just all of these great tools available for you to actually plan and perform the migration to a high level of satisfaction that it is going to migrate properly. And as I said, we'll take a look at the different workloads from that traditional IaaS, and we'll take a look at the migration from a storage component from, say, a SQL server, if it's doing an online or an offline migration of that data. And we also have some pretty cool tools to show you if you have large volumes of data, using a thing called DataBox and DataBox Heavy to move those large volumes of data from one location to the next. So let's get into that lesson. Microsoft has spent a considerable amount of time not only deploying our own resources into Azure and lessons learned, but documenting the best practices that we recommend to our customers. We've put together 2 major documents that I've referred to throughout this series, and I strongly recommend, as an architect, that you take a look at. They are the Cloud Adoption Framework and the Well-Architected Framework. In addition, there is the Azure Architect Center, which has sample architectures that we have built as a starting template. And through this series, we talked about a thing called Azure Landing Zones. So we've got a well-documented library of best practices that are a great place for you to be able to build your foundation as we go through this. And this is to introduce that you should take a look at what we're going to cover in this series, the plan, get ready, and then the adopt, using a migration framework. And it's all documented for you in the Cloud Adoption Framework. So all of this detail that I'm going to lightly cover now, as well as through the next couple of modules, if you delve into them, are all covered in depth in the Cloud Adoption Framework. So make sure you read that information. Now, specifically, we focus on the migrate efforts. As you take on-premises workloads and maybe as you end of life them, or they come up on a staged migration to move them into Azure, we have tools that we've developed that you can now use to assist you in this process. Early on, these tools were not there, and people would use a feature that I covered in another module called ASR, or Azure Site Recovery. They would use that to migrate the workloads to Azure and basically intentionally fail it over from their on-premises location to the cloud. Probably not the best method to do that. But one of the foundations that I want to put in here is we use a rule as we do this ourselves. The last person who puts a wrench on something is the person who owns all the problems that existed with that thing beforehand. So if you were to move a workload to Azure and you didn't have a benchmark, and that goes to that plan phase, it's lightly grayed out, but I would strongly suggest that in that planning phase, we're going to talk about some of the things you want to consider. They're all documented in that framework. You want to make sure that you've got benchmarks and that you have a like-to-like measurement that you can apply so that when you do migrate something to Azure and you spin it up and someone goes, it's running slower, you'll be able to have a benchmark to say, well, we've been able to run this application and it measures exactly the same or maybe better than it was running in that on-premises world. So make sure that, following these well-practiced and well-documented methods, it's going to give you the greatest chance of success in this migration process. So you want to assess the workloads. That's that first stage as part of the planning, identify what they are, get that benchmark measurements. You want to go through an evaluation process. You'll see this as we get into the demonstration of the tool. It comes back with a report of something that is ready to migrate, something that can migrate but maybe needs some mitigation. There's some things that won't be able to be migrated, and then there's going to be objects that aren't reported because maybe they weren't part of the inventory process. So that is that get ready. And then you go through and you do the migration. You do the validation to make sure everything's gone as according to plan. You've done those post-deployment measurements to compare them against the baselines. And then you actually can release those workloads to be used in Azure. Today, I'm going to be talking specifically about Azure architecture and focusing in on a migration framework and describe what that is and some of the things you might want to consider. So let's get into it. While this unit doesn't really cover about something very specific in Azure and actual tasks that are performed, we want to make sure that we're determining your migration strategy and what it is that you're working with. Am I trying to do a like-for-like comparison? Do I want to take an on-premises workload that is running on a Windows server that might be near an end of life and just migrate that to the cloud so I've got a like-for-like comparison? I still now have a end of life or soon to be end of life Windows Server running as an IaaS VM in Azure running the same workload. That's actually really good. That's possibly one of the 4 Rs they have here. And depending on whose documentation you read, Microsoft refers to the 5 Rs in our documentation. Some go as high as 7. And so you can retire as one of the features. So taking a look at what it is that I want to do. So rehost. I'm going to move a workload quickly to the cloud in a like-for-like comparison. It talks about it doesn't need immediate changes to the app or configuration. You're doing a rehosting. You're taking a VM running on premises. You're moving that possibly to a VM running in the cloud. You want to take a look at maybe refactoring. And so you're going to use Azure DevOps possibly to take that workload. So if all you needed was, say, maybe a Windows server or a Linux server to host an application, you might want to refactor that because now I've had a couple of customers as we ran this tool. It was a very large company. They identified 6,000 applications that they were wanting to migrate from on-premises to the cloud. Through the running of this tool, we identified 4,000 applications that could be refactored. So instead of running them on VMs on premises, we could move them to the app service plan capabilities because they were running on Windows and Linux servers just like they would have been on premises, except they didn't have to build and maintain them. We were able to take those applications and literally rehost them or refactor them to deploy them into an app service plan running as a platform as a service in Azure. Worked very quickly. Now, there was 2,000 applications that didn't meet the criteria through this evaluation process. And what you see, and I'm not going to get too deep into it in this lesson, it's covered in the app service session. To be able to deploy it to the cloud, it has to be able to run the current iterations of any of the infrastructure. So ASP.NET 3.x or 4. If you're running on an ASP.NET, ASP.2, you wouldn't be able to run it technically. That's what it says, but you don't know because it might run as long as you're not using the features that were deprecated from going from 2 to 3. So I'm not going to get into the whole feature, but with very small testing, they could refactor some of those applications and bring them into compliance to be able to make them to be able to move without having to redeploy them as rehosting on a VM in Azure. And that was their mandate. They said, we are not going to move VMs to Azure. We are going to fix the applications so that we can rehost them and go through this refactoring process. So they went through and changed whatever needed to be changed. You could re-architect the solution. So you can use your existing applications and maybe re-architect them and maybe bring them from a monolithic application into a microservice or go through an iteration process. Or then you could even rebuild the application or buy a different application because maybe you've got an application that's old and it was near an end of life and you want to replace it with the new one. So those are a number of the options to take a look at the strategies of what I'm moving. And I'm just not going to do a like for like. There's options for us in that migration process. Today, I'm focusing on Azure architecture and looking at the migration components and assessing your workloads. So let's get into it. As you take a look at the tools that we have for migration that I'll be demonstrating at the end, you'll see, I'll just go to the portal right now, that we have a series of tools that are available for us that allow you to migrate servers, databases, web apps, and using a tool called DataBox, data files in large volumes to Azure. So what you want to do is determine what to migrate and when to migrate it. In a previous module, we talked about the options of rehosting, refactoring, as you move the objects. Do I do a like-for-like comparison? And so just as you go through this is going to break it down into a bit more specifics, that same topic, and addressing what it is that you're moving. Windows Server workloads, as I just described for you. It actually has a process to go out and evaluate the servers that you wanted to migrate. So it's going to be the servers, not the database servers. They're going to be done through a different part of the tool, and you'll see that in the next line. We also can take a look at SQL Server workloads. So this is going to be SQL servers that are running SQL databases. They get migrated slightly differently, and we'll take a look at a feature when we delve into that. Are you going to do what's called an offline or an online migration? But Windows Server workloads are a way to assess the Windows servers, whether they be Linux or Windows. It will go off and find them if you want, or you can give it a list of objects you want it to go find and do an assessment against them to come back and tell you, are they ready? What might need to be done to them to make them ready for this move that you're dealing with? And they've done that same thing across all the different workloads that the migration tool can do. We can do an assessment against your Windows servers. We can do an assessment against the SQL servers, the Linux servers. We can take a look at the applications themselves. We even get into the custom applications of SAP HANA, as well as your specialized compute nodes in the HPC world. Today, I'm going to be taking a look at Azure architecture and specifically looking at the different tools that we have available for us to do the migrations. So let's get into this. In a previous module, we showed you a service that's available in Azure to go through and do a migration and follow the well-adopted framework and the cloud adoption framework in a best practice recommendations on how these things should be considered and done from a Microsoft perspective. These tools have been specifically configured to take the different types of workloads, and you see them all listed here on the slide, and do the appropriate assessments and inventory and gathering of the information, give you back some feedback about the success and the likelihood that these options or these objects would be able to be migrated successfully, get your approval, and then actually go through the migration process. We'll be actually doing a demonstration of one of these as we go through it shortly, but you'll see that the tool is available in the portal for Azure Migrate, and you can see these options listed for you right here. So we have the ability to go in and take a look at Azure Migrate for server assessments, and that's either Windows or Linux. There's a tool that gets downloaded. It's a virtual machine that can run the assessments either on premises. You can use this to migrate from one other cloud service to Azure as well. You can migrate database assessments. We can migrate an online and offline assessment that you're working with, as well as the applications and DataBox. We don't get too much into DataBox, but it is a tool that allows us to ship you disks in one of several formats. There's DataBox, there's Data Disk, and a thing called DataBox Heavy that allows you to move gigabytes to petabytes worth of data that might take quite a while over a wire transfer. We can transfer this through a secure encrypted device that comes to your location. You copy the data on it. We securely transport it to an Azure data center. We plug it into the Azure data center, let you know it's there. And then you use your encryption keys to decrypt that information and now upload it into Azure. But those are tools that are available for you to do these migrations. Today, I'm going to be taking a look at Azure architecture and specifically the database migration options that are available for you. So let's get into this. In a previous lesson, we talked about the migration tool in general. And actually, I did a sample migration of some workloads of a virtual machine. In the tool, we have the option to be able to migrate SQL servers. And I want to focus in on this, on the options that we have, because SQL servers typically are online. And depending on the criticality of the server, as well as the volume of data, you could have a huge impact on its actual performance and the time it might take to migrate those servers. And you have options of doing what's called an offline or an online migration. I just want to talk briefly about this, and then I'll do a demonstration to show you the unique features of how to do this. But for all intents and purposes, a SQL server that operates as a piece of software managing data, possibly in large volumes, on a virtual or physical server, I've got to migrate the server itself, the operating system that runs the SQL server. I got to move the application as part of that move. And then I got to have all the data there. And so what we have is the option to say, well, that could take a long time, but meanwhile, the SQL server, you're maybe running month end and it's getting pounded. How's that going to impact the operation of month end? How are you going to get all that crash consistent information and, migrating the data across? All of these are considerations. So basically, in a nutshell, what we're saying is, if you wanted to do what's called an offline migration to minimize the current running state of SQL and minimize that impact, what you can do is migrate the operating system, and it could take a while because you're not worried about that, and it's pretty consistent that it's going to be. Meanwhile, the data is changing consistently. The files and the tables are highly utilized. And so what you want to do is, I don't want to be trying to migrate this data as it's changing. What it does is it takes SQL, gets it migrated, the operating system, and it takes all of the schema. If you're familiar with SQL, that term defines all the table structures and all the interrelationships and the configuration. It migrates the metadata of the schemas to Azure. And then what you can do is you then do a backup or use a data box move of that data. So you copy the data at a time that's going to be more convenient for you. You take the SQL server offline, you ship that data, and then you restore that data because it may be volumes and terabytes of data. You can do that fairly quickly as opposed to over the wire. Restore that data because now you've got the image of the SQL server, the table structures there. So that recovery of the data can happen fairly quickly, and then you light up the server. So that's an offline migration versus doing this online. Again, if you got a non-highly used mission critical SQL server that has pretty well static data, you can migrate that possibly online. So those are the options that you have for your SQL migration. Today, I'm going to be looking specifically at Azure architecture and some of the considerations around the online migration tools that are available for us. Let's get into this. In previous lessons, I've covered the built-in Azure Migrate utilities that are available for you that will go through a full assessment process. It does an evaluation. It gathers inventory. It gives you states and success criteria that you're going to have. Fairly complex tool, does a great job. But we've got some other considerations that you might want to take a look at depending on the type of information that you're migrating. Is it workloads? Is it just data? So this is on top of potentially using something like the Azure Migrate tool. The first one we want to take a look at is this feature called Azure File Sync. Now, this is a service that's available to you regularly through Azure, but we're going to take a look at it specifically for a migration process. Azure File Sync is a capability to take two locations and synchronize the files between them. So in the case of files, this is a great tool as opposed to maybe the virtual machines the virtual machine that has files. You might want to take snapshots or something like that. But here we're going to take a file system. Maybe you got a file share. Maybe it's all of your HR policies and offerings that you have. Could be a document library you're dealing with. I got files, and I can synchronize that between two locations. Now, File Sync, if you're not familiar with it, can provide a whole bunch of features for you. There's a feature called branch caching that you're working with. So maybe you've got an on-premises server, maybe it's capped out, or maybe it's near an end of life. And instead of, taking that server and upgrading it, what you can do is you can take that file system, use File Sync to replicate that information to Azure. And so now you've got a replica of the information in Azure and on premises. So basically, you've kind of moved that. That's where we're talking about right here as a way to potentially move that information. Create a synchronization between the on-premises location and some location in Azure. And theoretically, you can just turn that on-premises server off and you now have that data existing in Azure. Where this feature is used typically is you can create that file sync as a form of a backup, but it's not really a backup because what you now have is if you delete the file, it will synchronize that as a deleted file into Azure. So not really by itself as a backup. The other feature that it can be used for is this thing called branch caching. Let's say I have a server that has 1 terabyte of data on it and it's getting regular data and I don't want to have to put more drives in there. What I can do is synchronize that data to Azure. So I've got literally unlimited storage and I can say any file that is older than 2 days old, for example, take them off of the local cache, free that space up, make it look like it's available, but if anybody asks for that file, bring it back down to the local copy. So in my example, I have a terabyte that is full. I don't have any more space. I don't want to put any drives in. I've now got the entire directory structure up in Azure. And let's say I go away on the weekend. So I did that on Friday. I come back on Monday. I open up that file share on my computer. It looks like all 1 terabyte's there, but literally no files are there. Because my rule was if they haven't been accessed in 2 days, wipe them off the local drive. All of those files exist in Azure. If I request one of them, it copies it down. So depending on the speed of your connection and the bandwidth, it will maybe just take a second longer, but it will open the file up and it keeps it cached locally until it's not used for 2 days. But it's freed up all of that space for new files to be copied into there and then replicates them up into Azure. So that's the Azure File Sync service, but it can be used as part of a migration tool for you to work with. It can also be part of a data box move, which we're going to get into as the next step. Another service that we have is the storage migration service. This is, I'm going to say it's a new service. It's a service that you can commission. It's a paid for service that allows you to take existing servers, maybe they're end of life, maybe you don't want to upgrade them or they don't meet the requirements that you need. You can replicate that information even down to the file shares and all the infrastructure. So I can build a new server. So maybe I've got, let's say, a Windows Server 2003. Goodness that you have one of those. Hasn't been supported for years. I can replicate that information and make sure that it replicates all the data, all the shares. Maybe there's some local user accounts that are on there that I need to be able to have to people log in with to access some of the services. I can take and not just move the files, but I can take some of that infrastructure configuration, as I said, the file shares, the file share names, maybe the server name, and I can replicate that to a new service running in Azure, building a virtual machine to be able to support that for you. So consider maybe the storage migration service if that meets your needs. Today, I'm going to be looking at Azure architecture and focusing in on an offline migration tool that you might want to consider. So let's get into it. Through a series of other lessons, we've taken a look at the migration through a variety of tools using the built-in features of Azure, using the Azure Migrate capabilities. We've looked at Azure Site Recovery Services and some other tools that are available for you. To be able to move large volumes of data, you could use that through a network connection if you wanted, but that has huge implications from that pipe might be used for regular business activity, could saturate the line. There's maybe data charges, the time it takes. So there's lots of considerations to move large volumes of data. Microsoft provides a feature called DataBox as a way to either import or export large volumes of data. And we have this feature called DataBox that you can go through that I'll do a demonstration of how to configure it. We're not going to actually do the migration. And you can see that on that slide, there's the two different versions, and they're basically just the reverse of each other. Now, this is a secure transfer of your data, and we're going to make sure that it's going to meet all your requirements. In fact, that it goes through bonded, secured couriers that do all of this. But we can do from your premise to Azure, or we can do it from Azure to your premises if you want. I did a migration for a large customer. They took all their data that they had at an offsite storage location, that they'd been storing all of their offsite information, paper, and all the way back to tapes and punch cards, believe it or not. What we did is we used that infrastructure that they had, the punch card readers, we took the tapes, we transferred that all into a digital medium, put that on DataBox Heavy, and transferred it to data and saved them a significant amount of money on a monthly basis to take that from that offsite file location or storage location and migrating everything to Azure. So there's one real example to do that. So just the reverse of each other. I'm going to go through in the demonstration, show you how to create up a DataBox Move job. You're going to create the type of disks that you need. We have three options that are available called DataBox Disk, DataBox, and DataBox Heavy that you can get to pick depending on the volume of data that you're working with. And we're going to ask you, where do you want it to ship to? And we'll get all that information from you. And it will create a set of encryption keys. These are yours, because remember, this is secure data. Whatever the type of disk that you ask will arrive at your location. You will connect that to your network infrastructure. And then you will use that encryption key to securely store the data on the data box or the data disk or the DataBox Heavy. You will then contact the courier, who will bondedly securely transfer that to an Azure data center of your choice. We will notify you when it arrives. We'll keep it secured. You will then ask us to mount that data. We will then mount it for you to then use your encryption keys to decrypt the information and copy it into the storage account of your choice. So that's the concept of using DataBox to move large volumes of data either in or out, or possibly even between Azure regions. Okay, so we've shown you the various types of migration. We've talked about the logistics component of it and how to configure the migration utility. Let's go in and do a demonstration of some of those features so you can see them live. And I've got some simulated portions, so, kind of like a baking show. I'm going to put a solution away, and then I'm going to minutes later pull out a baked solution, because sometimes, gathering information across thousands of virtual machines can take a while to gather that. But we'll go through a relatively exhaustive example of how this might take place, but show you that kind of end-to-end process. So let's get into the demo. Searching for the Azure Migrate service, you'll notice that on the blade, we get a variety of the different types of migrations and the steps that we talked about in the lesson. Under the migrate goals, we can migrate servers, databases, and web apps, just databases, web apps, and then there's DataBox Heavy. I'm going to start here just to get it out of the way, because the other three are variations of the same, and I want to walk them through beginning to end. DataBox was a way to move large amounts of data either into or out of Azure, so we can either import or export. You go through and select what is the subscription, what is the resource group that you want, what is the source region, what am I moving from, which Azure region do I want to move it into. It then provides you the options that are available from Data Disk, DataBox, and DataBox Heavy. You select that resource and then walk through and configure your data destination, your security from the encryption types you want to use to create that job. And then the items would be then shipped to you. You would plug that into your network, copy the data onto it, be encrypted, and then you would ship it back to Microsoft. We would notify you when it gets to the region that you want, and then we would mount that service, and then you could decrypt the data and then copy it into whatever storage account that you wanted. Now, looking at more of the traditional migration that we were talking about in the lessons, I'll come in and start a migration goal, and we're going to create a project. You give the project a name, a resource group, and a subscription, and create the project. There's not much to create in the project. It's all in the configuration. Now that we've got the project, if you go back to the topics we talked about in the lesson, we talked about do the planning, get ready, and then adopt. And there was a whole assess the workloads that you're working with, and then you deploy the workload. So in here, we're going to actually do the assessment portion. You want to discuss discover using an appliance or using an imported set of data. Through the discovery method, using an appliance, this basically becomes a virtual machine that you're going to create and then import into the virtual machine environment in your host location. So on premises, if you either had VMware or Microsoft Hyper-V, you would import this virtual machine, this appliance, and it would be used to gather the information that we need of the resources that you wanted to migrate. So I'm going to do the appliance, and then you select the virtualization type. As I said, it could be either Hyper-V or VMware. I'm going to use Hyper-V. You generate a key that we're going to use for that virtual machine. Now that I've generated my project key, I could download the Azure Migrated Appliance. As I said, this is just a VHD or virtual hard disk of a virtual machine that has the necessary resources to be able to collect information from the environment that has the virtual machines and the resources that need to be migrated and be able to connect them back to the migrate service here in Azure. So you can just download this file. It is quite a large file. It's going to download in this case to a zip file. And then we'll be able to extract it and import that virtual machine into my Hyper-V environment. Once you've gathered information about your host environment, you'll be able to run a variety of assessments against that environment. You'll get 4 values back, whether the resources are able to be migrated, whether they're able to be migrated with a few modifications, and they'll typically tell you what needs to be done. Whether it won't be able to be migrated, again, we'll tell you why you can't migrate it, or it was not able to reach those resources. It's either because they're turned off or usually a permission issue that you don't have the ability to run the assessments against those resources. After you've completed the assess phase, a similar process will be done with the migration tool. You'll do a discover, very similar to what we did before, where you're going to select a migration type. What type of virtualization do you want? And then you'll be able to run the hypervisor appliance to be able to discover those resources and then start the replication of those resources from on-premises to Azure. Let's return to the lesson. Welcome back from the demo. So you now saw the configuration from a beginning to end component of migration across a variety of different workloads. You know, I stopped along the way and showed you at this place I would do it for virtual machines. This is how I might do it for SQL. But we saw the very much similar process of setting them up for the various workloads that you're doing. We saw that some of the conditions that could be presented of, is it ready to migrate, or what might need to be done for it to migrate successfully. But this is at the heart of any architectural solution. Wherever possible, you know, and this is not just a marketing piece, you might want to move those applications from that on-premises legacy application and move it to the cloud. Hopefully throughout these modules, we've shown you that hosting infrastructure, even if it's back in the IaaS world, it's probably much safer and cheaper long-term to host this in Azure than that traditional on-premises environment. Now, yes, there's all sorts of reasons why that if you just bought a whole bunch of hardware and you got a 5-year life cycle for that stuff you might not want to move. But being able to have a real comprehensive migration plan, and maybe it's, you know, we're going to move this stuff right now because it's coming up on a hardware refresh. So we're not going to rebuy that hardware. We're going to move a portion of our application there. And maybe using a feature from another, the networking portion, we're going to have an express route to provide that network connectivity as if they were in the same data center. And then over the next couple of years, I'm going to migrate the remaining portions of that application and that infrastructure over into Azure as, you know, instead of having to repurchase that hardware in a hardware refresh cycle. So a big portion, I think, long-term for an architectural solution, it may not be the beginning part. You want to build the infrastructure first, you know, contact that on-premises environment. But I would always say that what is that long-term migration plan to really imagine and envision if everything were running in Azure. Don't have to do it, but as long as you plan your infrastructure and your build and that communication to anticipate that, it's up to you to make that decision when, where, and if. So thanks very much for paying attention. Hopefully you found these lessons useful, and I look forward to seeing you again at a future learning.